Everyone knew everyone in the tiny hamlet of Riverton. At least they thought they did. Tucked between a meandering river and undulating hills, it appeared ideal for a peaceful, beautiful life. But a crime so horrific, it left everyone wondering about their neighbors and themselves, rocked the peace in the village. Respectable in Riverton was Peter Marlowe. Having run the most prosperous building firm in the area, he was well known for his community service and charity. Elaine, a gentle woman who had devoted her life to charitable work and raising their only son, David, was his wife. They looked to be the ideal family. Benevolent on the surface, yet tensions were building under this bliss. David Marlowe was a brilliant young man, just out of college, eager to face life. He had always, however, felt under pressure to live up to his father's expectations, often driving David to reach more, be better, and never settle for anything less than excellence. Peter was a demanding man. David loved his father, but he also felt great animosity toward him about Elaine's treatment. David saw Peter's frequent absences and his icy, far-off treatment of her. The news of Peter Marlowe's untimely death devastated Riverton one wet evening. Although the police reacted fast, the first inquiry turned out a sad accident. In his grand, ancient mansion, Peter had fallen down the stairs, and the findings point to a fatal head injury. The village grieved, and Elaine and David presented courageous faces for the funeral, attended by almost everyone in Riverton. But murmurs started to float as the days stretched into weeks. Peter's tumble had been exactly opportune and too handy. Reopening the matter, the police viewed it more critically this time. Detective Sarah Lawson, a tenacious and bright and easygoing cop, oversaw the inquiry. She started to probe the life of the Marlowe family, revealing long-buried mysteries. Detective Lawson soon learned that Peter Marlowe had been having an affair. Many were shocked by the disclosure. For those who knew Peter well, it was less unexpected. His late evenings at the office and regular business trips had always appeared a little odd. The romance had been with Rachel, a younger lady employed by Peter's company as a secretary. Until it was too late, Rachel had no idea she was the other lady. By then, she was in love. Elaine had known about the romance for some time, but she decided to keep it under wraps in hopes Peter would come to sense and go back to his family. David wasn't as forgiving, though. Finding his father's treachery set out a fierce rage in him that intensified every day. He watched as his mother silently battled, her once vibrant spirit gradually withering. His long-standing animosity of his father started to sour and became something darker. David had faced his father the evening Peter died. Starting in the living room, the debate grew rapidly. David charged Peter of shattering his mother's heart and of ruining their family. Unaccustomed to being challenged, Peter answered with similar wrath, denigrated David and discounted his worries. David shoved his father out of a flash of anger. Though Peter lost his equilibrium and fell down the stairs, the shove was not intended to kill. David would be plagued always by the sound of his skull striking the hardwood steps in the house. Standing still at the top of the stairs, David gazed down at his father's dead body. He started to panic and hurried to present it as an accident. Together, he and his mother, who was upstairs, called the police, their anguish real but for different reasons. Detective Lawson started to fit the events of that terrible night as she carried on her inquiry. David's story's contradictions, his father's conflict with his kid, and the family's underlying problems all suggested something darker than an accident. Though the circumstances were difficult, Lawson was resolved to find the truth. She discovered Rachel, and that was the turning moment. Devastated by Peter's death, the young woman exposed all she knew about their connection. She talked about Peter's aspirations for a future with his wife, his promises to leave his wife, and his regret at betraying his family. Rachel's account depicted a man caught between obligation and passion, a man whose decisions had brought about his own ruin. Detective Lawson confronted David using this fresh material. Guilt and anxiety, weighing him, finally caused the young man to break down and confess. Although he said he never wanted to kill his father, he acknowledged pushing him in a flash of anger. Pent-up emotions and years of unsolved stress drove a terrible accident. David's admission resulted in his arrest. The matter proceeded before trial. Town people filled the courthouse, all keen to witness how the narrative would turn out. Heartbroken yet encouraging of her son, Elaine sat silently as the prosecution presented their case. The defense said that rather than premeditated murder, it was a crime of passion. They portrayed a young man snapping in a flash of intense feeling, driven to the brink by his father's acts. The jury judged David guilty of manslaughter ultimately. Considering the situation and David's regret, the judge sentenced David somewhat lenistically. David would serve time, although salvation and atonement were hoped for. Riverton was left to deal with the fallout from the catastrophe. Once a sign of success and security, the Marlowe family had been split apart by secrets and falsehoods. Now alone, Elaine found comfort in her charitable activities, devoting her time to serve others in need. Driven to atone for his deeds, David started to reconstruct his life from his jail cell. Detective Lawson headed on her next assignment, but the Marlowe family's narrative stuck with her. It served as a reminder that the deepest secrets can lie just under the surface, even in the quietest of settings. Sometimes, too, a tragedy is necessary to expose such secrets. David felt great weight on his actions as he sat in his jail cell. Unable to get away from the remorse and regret, he kept playing back that night over and over in his head. Although David lived in a demanding and merciless prison, he vowed to grow personally from behind bars. He went to counseling, took part in instructional courses, and tried to find the more fundamental problems causing his outburst. Elaine paid David frequent visits. Their talks were tinged with hope as well as grief. Reminding him he still had a future despite all, she urged him to be strong. Elaine personally was a transformed woman. Though the death of Peter and the ensuing controversy had been terrible, her community work gave her strength. Riverton came together around her to be supportive and sympathetic. Her heart had been poured into a charity, which turned into her haven, where she could focus her loss into constructive activity. Detective Sarah Lawson's life went on with fresh assignments and problems in meantime. But the Marlowe case stayed with her. It was a sobering reminder of the complexity of human nature and the little margin separating love from hate. The case marked a turning point in her career, since it highlighted her capacity for inquiry and her capacity for sympathetic understanding of the people engaged. Rachel, the lady central to Peter's affair, also had to face her own reckoning. Her scandal had driven her to flee Riverton in search of a fresh beginning in another town. Though it scarred her, the experience strengthened her. She promised never to let herself be in such a scenario once more, and committed herself to assist those caught in like circumstances. Although Rachel's road toward recovery was difficult and protracted, her new life gave her direction. Time went by, and Riverton started to mend. Though the Marlowe tragedy always lingered in the community, it progressively went back to its quiet life. The memory of Peter's death and the trial that followed vanished from view and turned into simply another chapter in the annals of the town. David spent his incarceration transformingly. He turned into a model inmate, respected by the staff as well as his peers. Early parole was a result of his good behavior and commitment to personal development. Ever hopeful, Elaine showed up for the hearing, her pulse pounding with expectation. David's narrative was listened to by the parole board. His regret was clear in every sentence. They came upon a young man who had made a grave error, but was sincerely trying to atone. David came out of jail after his parole was approved. Coming back to Riverton was difficult, but Elaine's relentless support gave him the bravery he required. The town's response was divided. While some welcomed him back with wide arms, acknowledging his efforts to grow, others stayed cautious. David knew their reluctance and expected no instant pardon. Rather, he concentrated on piecemeal reconstruction of his life. Appreciative of the chance to start over, he worked at a nearby hardware store. Therapeutic were the daily schedule and the straightforward, honest work. David started to slowly re-enter the community. Finding comfort in serving others, he served at his mother's nonprofit. The employment provided him direction and let him pay back the community that had given him a second shot. As the years went by, David's diligence and commitment were much appreciated. Renowned in the community for his humility and compassion, he grew to be Elaine's relationship with him became closer, their bond unbroken after all they had gone through. David's path was one of atonement, evidence of the human ability for change and the need of pardon. Detective Lawson carried on, her reputation as a competent detective developing with every case she closed. For her career, the Marlowe case stayed a significant point of reference, reminding her of the complexity of human feelings and the influence of her work. She found comfort in the idea that her efforts had unearthed the truth and started David on a road of atonement, so often considering him and the development he had achieved. Rachel also settled into her new life. Using her expertise to guide and encourage others, she carried on helping victims of domestic problems and infidelity. Her history stayed with her, but it no longer defined her. She had progressed, wiser and stronger, for the knowledge gained. The Marlowe family catastrophe turned out to be a tale of resiliency and atonement at last. It demonstrated that healing and progress are always possible, even in the face of the worst betrayals and darkest events. With its undulating hills and winding river, Riverton stayed a place where the past lived alongside the present, each narrative a thread in the rich tapestry of the town's history. David's reintegration into Riverton, nevertheless, was a tricky process. Every day presented fresh obstacles and chances for community validation of oneself. Among people who had before been cautious of him, he discovered surprising friends. By his voluntary activity and work at the hardware store, David created trusting and respectful relationships. Elaine, meantime, discovered fresh layers of fortitude within of herself. Her charitable efforts blossomed and turned into a lighthouse of hope for the less fortunate. Families coping with anything from financial difficulty to domestic violence found help at the community center she created. Elaine's interactions with Peter and David had given her a different viewpoint and the capacity for intense, personal connection with others. David's path of atonement underwent one of most important turning points when he shared his past publicly. David stood before Riverton's residents at a town hall event sponsored by Elaine's charity and related his experience. He talked of the demands he was under, his own wrath, and the great regret that followed. Many in the crowd were impressed by his candor and vulnerability, which broke down boundaries and promoted compassion and understanding. David's story was picked up by the media and soon extended outside of Riverton. To interview him, Elaine, and other important people engaged in the case, reporters arrived in the town. David's narrative evolved into a potent tale of metamorphosis, stressing the complexity of human feeling and the possibility for change. Though David stayed committed to his goal of atonement and positive community service, this increased attention had both beneficial and harmful effects. Now, seasoned investigator with many high-profile cases under her credit, Detective Lawson watched David's development with gratification. Seeing him flourish reaffirmed her faith in the court system's capacity for rehabilitation. She had always believed in his capacity for atonement. Although Lawson's profession had brought her great success, the Marlowe case remained a pillar, a reminder of the human narratives underlying every inquiry. Having recreated her life in a different place, Rachel tracked David's narrative from a distance. She contacted him, extending forgiveness and words of encouragement. Their letters helped both of them to finish a difficult chapter of their life and hope toward the future. The town of Riverton changed, yet kept its close-knit community and beautiful scenery. Though it had left its imprint, the Marlowe tragedy also brought about favorable developments. The town became increasingly conscious of the problems including mental health, domestic violence, and the need of community support. Elaine's philanthropy was crucial in these developments, since it created a setting free from judgment where others might ask for help. David started to consider the future more broadly as he became used to his new life. Enrolling in a nearby university, he studied social work and psychology. His dream was to work as a counselor, guiding others through the kinds of challenges he had encountered. His experiences endowed him with a special insight and great empathy, traits that would make him a great counselor. David's relationship with Elaine descended into a respectful and understanding partnership. Working for the organization, they each brought unique abilities to the forefront. Their relationship, developed through hardship, inspired those living in Riverton. David and Elaine were able to reach peace over time, though they learnt to live with it and find strength in their experiences. The suffering of the past never really vanished. Originally a site of tragedy, the Marlowe house was turned into a sanctuary of healing and hope. Elaine turned it into a community center where anyone may visit for fellowship, education, and support. Although Detective Lawson's career kept flourishing, she never forgot the insights the Marlowe case brought about. Understanding that the greatest approach to solve crimes was to address the underlying reasons before they could show up as something more severe, her work shifted even more toward prevention and community involvement. Rachel also settled into her new life, using her position to influence change and help others in like circumstances. She became a well-known advocate for mental health and awareness of domestic violence. Her past was always with her, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it stoked her will to change things. The Marlowe family's narrative ultimately proved one of resiliency, atonement, and the strength of community. It was a reminder that healing is a road that calls for patience, support, and the bravery to face the past, and that even in the worst of circumstances, there is always the chance of light. With its winding river and undulating hills, Riverton stood as evidence of this truth, a location where the past and present entwined to produce a future full of promise. Years went by, and the Marlowe family tragedy faded from Riverton's communal awareness. Still, its effects on the town and its people were indisputable, entwined with their common past. Now a qualified counselor, David Marlowe had embraced his new job whole. Originally his family's house, his workplace evolved into a haven for people looking for direction and encouragement in the very middle of the neighborhood. David's counseling business prospered since his genuineness and great sensitivity attracted individuals. Drawing on his own experiences to really connect with his clients, he focused in guiding people through family problems, trauma, and personal crises. Under Elaine's ongoing direction, the community center grew to include anything from mental health seminars to instructional courses. It evolved into a pillar of the community where development and recovery were fostered. David was in his office thinking back on his trip one evening as the sun sank below the horizon and stained the heavens orange and pink. He considered his road here, the individuals who had helped him, and the knowledge he had gained. A knock on the door cut off his ideas. Elaine was carrying a tray of tea and biscuits. She replied, laying the tray on his desk. "Thought you could use a break," with a friendly smile. "Thanks, Mom," David said, appreciative of her presence. Sipping their tea and savoring the peace of the occasion, they sat together in comfortable silence for a period. "You have come a long way, David," Elaine murmured gently, shattering the quiet. "I'm so proud of you." David nodded, emotions flooding him. "I could not have done it without you, Mom. You have been my rock through everything." Elaine stretched out and softly squeezed his hand. "We've both gone through so much, but we're coming out stronger on the other side, and together, we're changing things." One knock on the doorframe cut off their discussion. Now close friend, Detective Lawson, stopped by, following her shift. She had stayed always in their life, her friendship and encouragement priceless. Grinning and lifting a box of donuts, she inquired, "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not, Sarah. Come in," David said, his smile broadening. Sitting together, the three of them considered the past and the future. They discussed David's counseling job, the situations Sarah was working on, and the most recent community center improvements. Their close relationship was evidence of both the strength of the human spirit and the potency of friendship. The evening progressed, and the topic moved to Rachel. Over the years, David had stayed in contact with her. Their sporadic letters and phone calls had been a means of mutual encouragement and understanding. Recently launching her own nonprofit, Rachel concentrated on mental health awareness and help for people dealing with domestic problems and infidelity. Her work was becoming well known, and she frequently attributed her advocacy's impetus to her Riverton experiences. "Rachel's doing amazing work," Sarah said, clearly in appreciation. "She's come quite far, really," David nodded, his heart bursting with pride. "She is a fighter. We have all had our battles, but we have found our way through." The evening grew late, and finally Sarah said goodbye, pledging to see them once more for their next weekly gathering. Elaine and David locked the community center and cleaned. The usual ritual was a consoling end to the day. They felt great calm as they strolled home, the peaceful Riverton streets softly lit by streetlights. Elaine stopped at the entryway back at their house and gazed thoughtfully at David. "Do you ever consider what Dad might say should he be able to see us now?" David thought over her query, a range of emotions playing over his face. "I think he would be proud of us, Mom. Despite all, we have honored his memory by helping others and having a positive influence. That's what matters." Elaine nodded, and tears sparkled in her eyes. "I think that too." Finding comfort in their common strength, they clasped firmly. Though their path was far from over, they traveled it together, knowing they could surmount any obstacle. David carried on working in the years that followed, becoming to be a pillar of the community. Elaine's charity touched more lives than it has ever done. Now, mentoring younger detectives, Detective Lawson brought to every fresh case her abundance of expertise and compassion. As Rachel's company expanded, many people were greatly impacted. Once troubled by tragedy, the history of the Marlowe family turned into one of hope and resiliency. With its winding river and undulating hills, Riverton was evidence of the continuing force of community and the possibility of atonement. The town, its residents, and the Marlowe family had gone through their worst times and come out stronger, bonded by the ties of love, pardon, and the relentless belief in a better future.